Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar that is put on by Under One Roof and EcoCosi. My name is Mike Heffron. I'm the Chief Executive of Under One Roof Scotland. We today are going to be talking about the issue of how to install solar panels on multi-tenancy flat blocks, but basically sort of like how the process would work if you're in a tenement building and you wanted to put solar panels up on the roof, both the managing the process by way to doing so, but also sort of questions around the actual sort of solar panel installation and how that would work itself. Under One Roof, just to give you a little bit of background about the organizations that are taking part, and then I'll talk about our presenters today. But Under One Roof is Scotland's only charity dedicated to providing free and impartial information to tenement flat owners and housing professionals on issues related to tenement maintenance, common repair management, and retrofit. And we're joined today by Marc and Dimo from Changeworks. You see Marc there on screen. Changeworks is a leading nonprofit organization dedicated to decarbonising Scotland's homes and a just transition to net zero. Now, Marc and Dimo, who will be joining us a little bit later, is part of the EcoCosi service from Changeworks, and that is a home improvement service for homeowners and landlords. What we'll do is just a little bit about the background of our speakers. Stephen's going to be up first from Under One Roof. He joined us in March of 2024. Stephen's got a long history, over 40 years of history in housing in Scotland, both in the public and private sectors. His role at Under One Roof is to provide, as education and training officer, he provides support and information to tenement flat owner occupiers, landlords, and housing professionals in Scotland, and puts on lots of trainings and takes part in a lot of webinars. He also answers questions on Under One Roof's inquiry service, which allows people to get in touch with us if they're not able to find the information on our very extensive website about how to deal with particular issues in their building. So Stephen will be up first. Marc's going to be joining. Will be on a little bit later from Changeworks EcoCosi service, and he spent much of his working life tackling the climate crisis as a trained energy assessor and soon to be certified retrofit coordinator. Has a wealth of experience when it comes to understanding home energy efficiency. And before Marc joined EcoCosi, Marc established and ran a successful solar panel and battery installation service in Glasgow, so has a lot of knowledge to bring. Just a little bit about, before we get started, just a little bit about the Big Marker webinar service we're using. You'll notice that there is a chat function, probably on the right-hand side of your screen. That's an opportunity for you to put any, if you have any issues or any comments that you'd like to make about the speakers. If you have questions, we'd ask that you put them in the next tab over. It says Q&A, and you should see that there's a message in there welcoming you to that. That would be a place to put in questions. You can pop questions in that you want answered at the end of the presentation, where Dimo, who also works for the EcoCosi service, will be joining us in as well. And Stephen, Marc, and Dimo can answer or hopefully answer your questions. If we do run out of time, we can definitely, we would encourage you just to send us an email at info@underoneroof.scot. We'll put that into the chat room. So one way or another, we'll get back to you with any questions, to answer any questions that you might have. Finally, you'll notice there's a section called handouts that has copies of the presentations that are being put on today. We'll make sure we get Under One Roof's presentation up in there as well. But we've got resources in there that people can download right now and take away with them. After the presentation, you will be automatically emailed a link that for the video for this, so you can go back and watch it or share it with others, people that are in your building or anyone else that's interested as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Stephen. Stephen's going to spend about 20 minutes talking about sort of the general issues around organizing retrofit in your building. A lot of pretty much everything that Stephen's talking about can apply to also repairs and maintenance in your building too. So there's a lot of crossover on this. And obviously the issue of retrofit is very much connected to maintenance and management of common repairs in your building. And so Stephen's going to be talking a lot about that. And then at the end, we'll bring Stephen back in after Marc spoke, and we'll take questions from you. So Stephen, over to you.
There we go. No, hold on. My mic's on. My mic is unmuted. There we go. Waiting for my slides. Good afternoon, one and all. I'm just waiting for my slides to appear, and you don't have to look at my ugly mug for a while. There we go. Okay, so thank you, Mike, for that. As Mike says, my name is Stephen Kelly. I'm one of 2 education and training officers with Under One Roof. Now, I don't know, Mike did touch on this, but Under One Roof for Scotland's only charity providing free information on repairs, maintenance and retrofit for anybody who's got a stake in tenement buildings throughout Scotland. Now, that may well be owners, landlords, private tenants, housing professionals, including property factors, letting agents, architects, surveyors. So anybody with a stake in it can contact us at our wonderful website, which is www.underoneroof.scot. And if you haven't checked it before, please don't hesitate to check it out. Okay, so before we go into the legislation and how you manage common repairs, we always think it's useful to put up this slide on what is a tenement. We all know what a tenement is: 8-story high, 3-story high, in properties throughout Scotland. But in the 2004, the Tenements Scotland Act also defined it, and I'm not going through the legal gobbledygook there, but generally speaking, it also includes, for those from a housing background, a cottage flat or 4 in a block, converted villa, these big properties you'll find in Glasgow. It's the West End, East End. You'll find them in every big city in Glasgow, that were owned by, in Glasgow particularly, tobacco lords, maybe in Edinburgh, merchant bankers, and have now been converted into flats. So some of these properties will have 8 flats in them, 4 flats, 2 flats, whatever. But they are still covered under the terms of the Tenements Scotland Act from 2004. And it also includes high-rise multi-storey flats or low-deck access flats as well. So they're still covered, because they're flats, under the Tenements Scotland Act. Although the Act doesn't cover houses, detached, semi-detached, terraced, townhouses, if you were to access our website, you may find valuable information on other issues that might be useful to you when you're managing and maintaining your own property. Okay. So, if you're looking to install solar panels, then general considerations includes who owns the roof, obviously, because the solar panels go on the roof. So is that owned by the 2 people at the top of the flats? Is it a joint ownership? How do you carry out maintaining your roof? Again, is it joint ownership or is it managed by one particular owner? Generally speaking, how your common repairs managed? Do you have a factor? On your titles, is there anything in your title that permits, restricts or prohibits what you're thinking of doing? Who owns the required access routes and access for installation of solar panels? Do you have to speak to your downstairs neighbours on the ground floor for permission to install scaffolding? Can the scaffolding go in from the back court, and who owns that as well? How are you going to decide on future maintenance costs, future maintenance issues, and are there any shops attached to your property? So general consensus of what sort of you have to think about. It's not just simple going, I'm going to install a solar panel on my tenement property. Right. Relevant legislation, I've narrowed this down to 4. I mean, Under One Roof do training on legislation. And if you do ever suffer from insomnia, then please don't hesitate to sign up for it. It's because we can do a whole hour on legislation. But in this particular case, what we're looking at is your titles, the Tenement Management Scheme, Development Management Scheme, and the Property Factors Act. Now, before I go into the principal legislation on this particular session on solar panels, if you stay in a newer type development, that can be flats, it can be houses, it can be a mixture of both, you will probably have title deeds under what's called the development management scheme. So any new properties that since the 2000s, you may well find you've got a different set of titles, but it's the same as title deeds, although it's just in one whole document. Okay. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're looking at principal legislation. And the first part of the is your titles. Now, I know people call them title deeds, deed of conditions, real burdens, but they are the titles. I've been told that by a board member, you must call it the title, Stephen. So it's the titles, okay, which covers the address of the property. It will have your name on the titles, and we will have any charges you've got on that property. So if you've got a mortgage, if you maybe have the disability grant, you've maybe secured other loans on the property, that will be under the charges on that particular title. But the most important thing, the thing we have to refer to here, is your deed of conditions or the real burdens. So the real burdens explains what parts of the building are commonly owned and your responsibilities for maintaining those particular areas. And what's also classified as an individual repair or a mutual repair. And probably what people are more interested in, how much it's going to cost me. So we're allocating splitting costs, and that may well be simply, if you're talking about an 8-flatted property, you split it 8 ways, or you may find some properties are bigger, so therefore they have to pay extra than other people in that property. But that's all in your title deeds. And as I say there, if the titles cover all the bases, they must be followed. Now that's one, I say, that's a wonderful website, but in the bottom of most pages, you'll see that. Please check your title deeds. The titles are gospel. That is what has to be followed on all occasions. Unless there's gaps in those titles. So silent, unworkable, shared costs don't add up to 100%. And we get that regularly through our inquiry page, where maybe people are saying, well, I want to carry out a repair. I've checked my titles, but the shared costs add up to 112%. If that happens, you can then refer or default to the tenement management scheme, which is simply a model set of title deeds, but it makes it easier for owners to manage their property in terms of what counts as maintenance and how a cost share between owners. Okay. The big difference when the 2004 Tenement Scotland Act was introduced, it changed one major aspect, that the roof is now a shared responsibility, and say it with me, unless the titles say otherwise. Okay, so the titles cover all the bases, you follow them. If not, the roof can become a shared responsibility, irrespective of where you stay in that property. For the ground floor flat, and the titles don't say the roof is owned by the 2 top floor flats, you have to pay your share for any maintenance works that have to be carried out. Okay. I put this slide in because it always crops up when we do presentations, either in person or online, is that people may well have factors. Now, the Property Factors Act was introduced in 2011. So if you have a property factor, they must be registered on the public register. In 2011, they also introduced a code of conduct, which each factor has to adhere to. It was introduced in 2011 and updated in 2021. So if you were and you stay in a property with a factor, they should issue with a written statement of service to you, which details how they're going to deliver services and what those services include. And if you're not happy with your factor, you can always take them to the first tier tribunal. Okay. Now, big issue that crops up when you're talking about installing solar panels or any improvement is whether it's classified as a maintenance issue or an improvement issue. And again, the first point of call for all of these issues is check your title deeds. That will tell you what is classified as maintenance and what is classified as improvement. So maintenance covers the usual suspects, your routine repairs and general maintenance. However, just to throw a wee curveball in as well, maintenance can also include replacing your existing heating system. So if you've got a gas boiler and it's beyond repair, removing it and putting a new gas boiler in, for example, can still be seen as maintenance. Okay. Second curveball is insulation is classified as maintenance. So if you're putting external wall insulation onto a property, it is not deemed as an improvement, it is deemed as maintenance. Okay. even though, as I say, that they can consider maintenance in practical terms. But generally speaking, improvements are anything that's added to the property since it was first built. Okay, so it could be new facilities, upgrading existing structures, or adding new features. Although, unless you're talking door entry systems, and that can still cover the maintenance, unless you do a new door, don't start me. But a whole session on that in Dundee, going around the houses with people, but they did have a door, they didn't have a door, and whether putting new door entry systems improvement or not. But anyway, for the purposes of this presentation, if you're installing solar panels, that is now deemed as an improvement, as it enhances your energy efficiency and can increase its market value, although there's no guarantee in that. As far as decision making is concerned, the tenement management scheme does not cover, well, it covers improvements. In fact, it has to be a unanimous consent of all affected owners, okay, unless your titles say otherwise. If your titles have something in there that mentions improvements, you have to follow them. If it doesn't, and I say tenement management scheme generally deals with maintenance issues, you would have to get the unanimous consent of all owners, okay, even if it doesn't affect them. So if the top 4 flats want access to solar panels and the links into their property, you still need all 8 properties to agree with that. Although the payment for that may well just be targeted at the properties that are getting the benefit of the solar panels. So what I've said there is owners do not agree can often block improvements. There's always a bad apple in tenement properties. And if there wasn't, then probably under one roof wouldn't be in existence and I'd be out of job. However, you can maybe talk these people round by saying, look, if you vote for it, you don't have to pay for it. But generally speaking, improvements need 100% consent from all the owners in the property, unless the titles say otherwise. I put in this slide of Owners Association because it's flavour of the month. There is a consultation paper going through the Scottish Government at the moment looking at whether we should have compulsory owners associations. But in the meantime, if you have establish an owners association in your block, it can make it easier to make decisions, make it speedier. It can have one point of contact for contractors. It can have one point of contact for factors. It should have a constitution, obviously, an agreed set of rules, decisions, office bearers. So standard issue about owners associations. As I say, you can find more information on our website about that. Okay. Managing the process. Now, if you are thinking of doing something, as I say, you need 100% consent from all your neighbours, you may have a difficulty finding owners and landlords. If you're looking for an owner, then you can use Register of Scotland. If you're trying to trace a landlord, you can contact a local authority in the first instance through the landlord registration team and see if they know of any details, or you can contact the Scottish Landlord Register at that website address. If you suspect a property has been empty for a while and you're not sure why, again, in the first instance, you can contact your local authority who may be able to advise you, or contact Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, who may know what's happened to that property and may have plans for it in the future. However, as Mike says, although we're talking about solar panels today, managing the process for anything includes proper procedures. I'll need to find a new phrase for proper because I keep on stumbling on words, proper procedures. And as I say at the bottom, the reason you have proper procedures is that an owner can appeal against decisions if these procedures have not been followed or adopted. So we would recommend if you're going to install solar panels, you want to get all your neighbours on board, you call a meeting, given at least 40 hours notice. And all those with a business background or committee background will understand that everything has to be recorded in writing. The purpose of any meeting, the agenda, minutes, any decisions. And when a decision has been agreed, all owners must be informed in writing. And if you're going to go further on, we're going to install the solar panels, what your procedures are, what the timescales are to carry that on. Okay. But say the reason for that is that any owner can appeal the decisions. So if you end up going to the sheriff court to get them to pay their share, they might appeal, going, well, nobody told me about it. I didn't get a letter. I wasn't got an email. I didn't get a text. I didn't know anything about it. Okay. Nowadays, we're living in the 2025. You can actually get around that by taking videos of sticking a letter through his door. You can take photographs. You can send him emails, record them, read receipts, all those things that are around about to make sure that person can't say they weren't informed. So if you get a meeting arranged, you then have a vote. And again, depending what the titles say, generally speaking, these are the rules that apply. There's one vote per flat, including jointly owned flats. In fact, recently I came across a property where there's 3 owners of the flats. Doesn't matter, it's one vote per flat. An owner can nominate another person, like a family member or a letting agent, to vote on their behalf. But again, it's still one vote per flat. And generally, decisions can be made by a simple majority of owners, unless the title set a higher threshold, for example, 2/3. Decisions pending on all owners and all successors, even if they did not agree. So if you've taken proper procedures to carry out a meeting and everybody's been properly invited to that meeting, and out of the 8 people in the block, only 6 people turn up, and 5 vote for the solar panels, and 1 votes against, and 2 people didn't turn up, that decision is binding on all owners, even if they did not agree or did not attend the meeting. Downside to it is a tied decision, 3 out of 6, 4 out of 8, 6 out of 12. It's not a majority decision. And if that happens, you cannot proceed with installing solar panels. You could enforce repairs, but that's for another session. That's for another webinar. As I say, if you want information on legislation, check us out. Generally, if general consent is required for installing solar panels, you obviously speak to the neighbours you love dearly. You've maybe got to look at general maintenance issues, any repairs that have to be done to the roof before you consider going ahead with the work. Is there any access rights you need to agree? Do you need to introduce a deed of servitude, a legal document to get people to agree with it? If you've got a mortgage, do you need lender consent? And obviously planning permission and building warrants may be useful or may be vital as well to consider. Okay. In terms of planning permission, solar panels are normally considered permitted development, with the exceptions of if you maybe stay in a listed building, you may have to obtain listed building consent, or if you stay in a conservation area. This is required if the panels are installed on the front or side elevation of the building facing a road. But if you're talking about planning permission and anything under other consents, it may be useful to take legal advice or contact a local authority for clarification. They may be able to assist you in the process. In terms of building warrants, if you stay in a cottage flat or a 4 block, then you don't require a building warrant. However, if you stay in a building over 2 stories, which is most tenements in Scotland, you will require a building warrant. Okay. Miscellaneous issues I've covered down here, but I'm sure Marc will cover it in his presentation. Structural integrity. Is the roof strong enough, obviously, for solar panels, or it needs repaired? You have to comply with building standards, and obviously there's an issue of grid connection. Again, I'm sure Marc will cover that in his presentation. Okay, so I'll put on this, how can Under One Roof help? Obviously, as Mike touched on, we've got a lot of information on our website, vast arrays of information. You might not be able to find it. Answer inquiries on a regular basis, and sometimes I can't find it. Although I don't ask myself the question, but anyway, if you have got experienced that and you need some expert advice, on the front page of our website, in the top right-hand corner, there is Ask the Expert button. Hit that. We simply ask for your email address, your local authority, where you're coming from, you're an owner, a landlord, a housing professional. Put in your details and we'll get back to you with a detailed reply as soon as we can. I'm no expert, but if I can't answer the question, I've got lots of people behind me with lots more, or learned colleagues, I call them, who'll be able to reply to your inquiry, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Or if you don't have access to the website, you can just simply email info@underoneroof.scot, and it appears that everything comes to me at the moment. Okay. The other thing is you can contact Local Energy Scotland and get access to excellent guidance notes prepared between Local Energy Scotland and Harper McLeod solicitors for more details on solar panels and any hurdles you may have to come or overcome to try and get this work done. Finally, I've put the feedback page up. It's not relevant in this particular presentation because Rebecca, our comms officer, will send out every recording along with comments and a feedback question. So thank you for listening, and we'll put you on to the main star of the show today. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, well, that was very, very informative and really valuable. And as someone who has installed lots of solar panels, especially on some bigger buildings, it's really helpful to know that. So, oops, we are on the, there we are. Nope, why is it? Sorry, I'm just trying to get it to go to the right slide here. Let's start at the beginning. So what we want to talk really about today is a bit of the technical elements of solar. So what's required if you want to put solar panels on your roof of a tenement building? What do the systems look like? How are they wired up? What are the different costs? What are you trying to, how do you maximize the benefits of this? Because as Stephen's presentation showed, there's quite a bit of prep work that needs to happen to get all the ducks in a row before you're actually getting an installer on site, much more than a single ownership property would encounter. So once you're there, you really want to make sure that that's valuable. Also, I've also pitched this a little bit to how do you convince maybe people who are on the fence within your property that this is a worthwhile investment in their property. So just a little bit about EcoCosi, Changeworks. So Dimo and I are the retrofit coordinators for that. So we work with our clients who are basically individual homeowners to improve the energy efficiency of their property. So we're really looking at insulation, ventilation, and so the tech side of things, so heat pumps, heating, and solar, that kind of thing. So we offer an approach in 3 phases. We work with clients, we do an assessment, a deep dive assessment on any property, and then we provide recommendations. From there, we then have a network of vetted installers, so we connect you with them. And then once the installation is begun, we also can do quality assurance work. So you can pop in and out of any one of these phases. This is not something that you need to do the whole sequence to get some value out of. You could pop in for anyone that you think is valuable for you. So we have, as our mission, I think that was mentioned, that Mike mentioned at the beginning, is to decarbonise Scotland's homes. There are 1.5 million privately owned Scottish homes that require retrofitting, i.e. retrofitting of the energy systems to become carbon neutral, or at least reduce their carbon impact. And that's equivalent to 200 homes a day over 20 years. So we're a long way from that, but we're trying to get there. So let's start at the top. So the first thing we're really going to deal with, I think, in this situation realistically, is the value proposition. So if you're in a position where you want to install solar panels on, let's say, an 8 in a block, you're going to have to convince the other homeowners to go along with it. So why would you want to do this? Well, besides the environmental impact, which is now you're reducing your carbon impact by having renewable energy directly used in the house. The real benefits are things like lower bills. So a solar panel system will replace the energy costs with free energy. You might even be in a situation where you can sell back to the grid, so there's some value to that. And once it is really an investment in the property. So we do see often that it does increase the value of the property, because you're increasing the EPC rating on the house. You are lowering the cost of operations for that property. So it's quite attractive. And as a landlord, if you need to meet EPC requirements, this can help you do that. It's very attractive to your tenants because it reduces their bills, and it does increase the value of the property if you happen to sell it on. We have seen research showing that sort of environmentally responsible properties have higher occupancy rates over time. but that's more for commercial buildings. But it does apply, I think, across the board. So to reiterate what Stephen was saying earlier, one of the things before you start is really looking at the condition of the roof. We do want to take into consideration one of the bigger expenses, especially with tenement buildings, will just be getting access to the roof. So, with smaller properties, that may even be done with a ladder in some cases, which is basically free. That won't have any charge. But, the likelihood is that you will be putting a scaffold up. At the minimum, an access scaffold if it's a flat roof. If it's a pitched roof, then you'll be having, a full-on scaffold. Again, this is probably where the building warrants come in, because especially if this is on the street side, then you need to put a scaffold up over the sidewalk. So if you're going to have that expense involved, it's very good to maybe organize other things. So looking at the gutters, looking at the flashing, repairing any windows. If you wanted to do external wall insulation, this is the time to do it. So this might be something where it becomes a much larger project, or could just be a cherry on the top. The other thing is you'll have to do a structural engineering check for the roof. Even for pitched roofs, the panels don't weigh that much. But the issue is that with wind, what we call wind loading, this creates negative pressure on the outside of the panel that can lift the panel up, and that pulls on the framework. And in very high winds, let's say, talking 80, 90, 100 miles an hour, which we do occasionally get in Scotland, then that can potentially cause damage to the roof if the roof isn't strong enough. With flat roofs, those panels are probably put in tubs and then are ballasted, so they're not actually attached to the roof. So checking the structural integrity is about whether the roof can actually take that weight. And I have seen situations where the structural engineer has come back and rejected the project, even though there were steel girders and a cavity brick construction, because the roof was just designed to take only its weight and maybe a little bit of snow, but not enough to put ballasted tubs on there. So you really do need to do that. Usually that will be part of the assessment done by the installer, but it's always good to know what to ask for and to make sure that you get to see the results firsthand. So the assumption we've made for this presentation is that since it's a unanimous thing, that you probably have to get unanimous consent from all the flat owners, that probably everybody's going to opt in, and we're going to do it. So if we gave an example of what that would look like, then 8 flats, let's say with 60 square meters of roof to work with, we would assume maybe 10% unusable space, maybe a bit more. The thing that we're really looking for there is, you can't go too close to the edge on a pitch roof. We also want to check on shading. If there's too much shading on the panels, obviously it's not worth it to put a panel in that part of the roof. And I'll explain a little bit more about why that is later, because there are different options in what you can install that affect how shading affects the panel system. So let's say each flat gets about 6 panels. Panel capacities now run between about 450 to, let's say, 510 for domestic applications. So you're talking about 2.7 kilowatts of rated capacity. What that practically means is that you'll be generating about 2,160 kilowatt hours a year in our current latitude. Obviously, the further south you go, the better that gets. But in Scotland, you can kind of basically finger the wind. It's 80% of whatever the rated capacity of the system is. Solar panels generate in what's called DC, direct current. But we use alternating current in the house because alternating current is safer. It's fusible. In other words, if something happens, then the fuse blows and the current is broken, so there's no current running through the wires. DC current doesn't do that, so the current is always live as long as there's sunshine going through. So the amount of DC cabling that you'd have from a solar panel system is going to be very limited as much as possible. And if it's inside the property, it should be properly sheathed, which means like there's some sort of conduit ducting that it goes in with labels that show that it's such. So that needs to go to an inverter, and the inverter basically takes the electricity that's in direct current and shifts it into alternating current. And those are on standard rating. So in this case, you'd have a 2.5 kilowatt inverter. Don't focus too much on that. I mean, if you had a slightly larger rated panel system, the inverters can handle peak capacity above their rating, but generally you don't want to do that too much. So the installer will size the inverter based on how many panels you have. And what that looks like in a line diagram is just, let's say you had one big array of panels for everybody. You're still going to wire those in a series in what we call a string. So each flat is going to get a certain specific set of panels that are wired directly to their flat. So let's say in this case, each flat gets 6 panels. Those are going to be wired to an inverter within the flat. And each flat is going to get its own inverter, and each flat is going to get its own specific set of panels that are wired to that inverter. So again, the shading of that is going to matter. So it should be really taken into account that, let's say, you don't disadvantage one particular flat by having them right next to have all their panels, let's say, right next to the chimney or something like that, where they're constantly getting shaded, because it will impact their overall production. So when you speak to the installer, that's a design element that should be taken into consideration. Generally, what we're looking at here is, as we mentioned, about 80% of the rated capacity is what your production would be in Scotland. So in this case, 2,160 kilowatt hours in a year. That also equates to about 80% of the typical household's annual usage. That's for gas heated homes. So we're not talking about if you're doing electrical heating, because your usage will be higher. But if you have storage capacity, you might be able to, like storage heaters, you might be able to utilize them as a kind of heat battery in this case. So the mismatch in this case will be that you're producing the most of your electricity in sort of mid-afternoon and most of it in the summer months. I'll show you some charts that show you the breakdown of that over the year, because it's quite significant, and that gets more significant the further north you get. So there's basically 2 options to that. You can either install a battery, or you can change your usage. So one easy way to do that might be things like waiting to turn your white goods on until you usually have like an app that shows you, and we'll give you an example that shows you what your current generation looks like. Just wait to turn your white goods on until you get, let's say, a kilowatt of generation from the system. Or you can set them on a timer so that they would hit peak generation time in the afternoon. So what we want to look at particularly is the panel type. So what kind of panels are we getting? You can get all black panels that have black back sheathing. You do lose some efficiency on that, but not by much. Black rims. So you don't necessarily have to get that sort of ugly classic style blue panels with a white back that really kind of show each individual cell. You can get them so they're a little bit more discreet, especially if you have things like a black slate roof. All black panels might look nice. The inverter type, you're going to have a regular. If you don't have a battery, you'll just get a regular inverter. If you have a battery system, you'd get what's called a hybrid system, and basically batteries store and utilize energy in direct current as well. So you need to have an inverter to translate the electricity into alternating current, into AC current, if you have a battery. So usually it's just one inverter does the job of both. You want to consider where that's going to be. What you see here in the photographs is a typical setup. So you need to have these cutoff switches. So if there's a problem, if there's a fire in the building, those switches are going to want to be turned off. If you don't get a chance to get to them, the fire service will know that there's something on the roof, and they can get there and turn them as well. You might need to have an expansion board, because you need to have fuses both for the inverter and a battery system. So, and also, where's the cabling going to go? As I mentioned, we don't really want to be cabling excessively in a building with direct current cabling, but obviously we've got to get from the roof to the inverter in the flat, so that's got to be done. So we want to look at where the ducting is. If we have a battery system, consider the fact that batteries are very heavy still. I'm sure that will change over time, but mostly they're quite weighty. It is now kind of moving towards installing them outside. So if you have an option to do so, most of these are what's called IP65 rated, which means they can get wet. You still want to have some kind of a covering over something that's IP65, so it's not directly like hit by the rain. But simple some sort of simple roof covering where it's not in direct rain will be sufficient. If it's not an opportunity, if it's not an option, you can still put them in the property. You might choose to put them in the loft, so up above, but it depends. And I would speak to the installer about your options on that. But again, it'll take some room. So this is a standard setup. I think that's a 5 kilowatt hour inverter, and 5 kilowatt hours is probably perfect for the standard flat of, let's say, 1 to 2 people. A house of 4 people will use between 10 and 12 kilowatt hours a day of electricity. So when you get a battery size, I would say size according to that, and I'll show you there's a good reason for that. Because when we want to calculate the value of installing a battery, if we're getting a solar panel system, because that will likely somewhat, not quite double the cost of installing solar, but it also doubles the payback. So it's a bigger budget to get the battery system in there, but also you get a lot of value from the battery. So the first thing is you're obviously storing energy during the afternoon, let's say when you're at work. So when you come home to use electricity, that means you're using it from the battery and not off the grid. So it maximizes the amount, because you're generally going to get between 8 and 9 pence a kilowatt hour right now in the current market to put back to the grid, whereas obviously you're going to be paying between 27 and 30, maybe even more pence a kilowatt hour to buy off the grid. So if you're just putting it into the battery, then you're offsetting those costs. So that's, if you think about it, you're going from 30 pence a kilowatt hour to use it to down to 9 pence or zero. So if you've got a battery system that's then in the winter time, you can actually store during off-peak hours, which is usually between 2 and 6 p.m. a.m. So in the middle of the night. So what will happen is the battery system will be set to store during those hours at the cheapest possible rates. So this is why I mentioned earlier, size your battery system according to what you think your daily usage will be, because that means you can effectively move your energy costs with the battery system, irrespective of a solar panel system generating during the day, from whatever it is that you're currently paying 27 or 30 pence down to 9 pence or 8 pence or whatever. I've heard of even as low as 6, I think. So that's quite valuable. So you have a different kind of seasonable shift. During the summer, you don't want to do that because you're getting free electricity from the solar panels. But during the winter, when solar panels aren't generating, that's going to be valuable. And when you look at this is an example of what that looks like. Usually you'll have an app, it'll show you what your current generation is. So again, going back to what I said about when you start your white goods, you can always check your app to say, hey, have I reached the amount equivalent to what these white goods would draw off the grid? And now I can turn it on and it'll all run off the solar panel system. If I've got a battery system then, or an EV charger, if that's possible, then you can get systems that are all wired in and then show you that as well. But this gives you an example of how much different what the seasonal changes in the solar generation. So in these months here, you're going to get quite a lot. You'll probably be effectively off grid with that system. You won't be buying off the grid. During the winter months, you're really going to see a big drop. And this is where the battery system comes into its own, because it can effectively make up the difference. And yes, you're paying, but you're paying much, much less because you can then buy at an optimal time. Let's say when there's peak generation and at night with the wind farms, and energy companies are desperate to sell energy to anybody, then you can create demand in that time, dump it in the battery for cheap, and then use it during the day when otherwise prices would be more expensive. Another consideration when you're getting installed is permissions. So a typical home, putting in like the 4 kilowatt system, they don't have to get permission. In other words, they just go install it and then let the DNO, which is the district network operator. So they'll let the DNO know that they've installed something afterwards. Even with smaller systems, if you're doing multiple systems within a building, you need to do an application called a Group G98 before the installation. Now, again, the installer should be taking care of all of this, but it's always good to be knowledgeable about what to ask for and then make sure that they're on top of that process. Because the last thing you want to do is have a mismatch between when you get permission or not and ordering things like a scaffold, which has cost you quite a bit of money, or that equipment orders go in, and then you come back, the DNO comes back and says, well, actually it's going to cost you extra money to connect to the grid because we need to upgrade the local grid infrastructure where your building is, and that's going to cost you extra money. And suddenly that takes something which would have been doable and makes it into something that's not doable. So that's important. I would say in most cases, you're not going to have more than a nominal charge just to do the assessment, which is probably maybe 100 quid a pop. But it is possible. Usually there's enough grid infrastructure in big cities where tenements are located where that's not going to be a factor. And in fact, it might even view a little bit of extra local generation as a positive. But if you think about what the DNO is trying to do with these permission processes, is basically say all the energy that could possibly be generated by this system, plus any of the energy stored in the battery that could be put back to the grid, what would happen if all of that went at peak capacity out to the grid? Would that cause like transformers to back up and have a problem? So that's the assessment they're doing when you're doing these applications. And if they do find a problem, then they say, oh, actually the design shows that the grid cannot accept that level of generation. They may ask you, they may either charge you to upgrade, or they may ask you to just dial back, scale back the amount of the size of the system. So those are things to consider, and it's 12 weeks turnaround. So you can really think about this as a 3-month process, and you want to get that in and done early. Finally, let's talk about roof access. So, because I think that's an important one. Again, usually your installer will have a relationship with the scaffolder because they're using that every day, and they'll get much better rates than you would ever get. But it's important that they, especially for tenement building projects, that the scaffolding costs be delineated, because you want to know exactly what it is that it's costing you. That also tells you in the future, hey, if we have a maintenance issue, what's it going to cost to get on our roof? And again, it also maybe makes the value play to say, hey, if it's costing us like X thousand pounds to put up a scaffold, is there other maintenance works that we could do at the same time and we can layer it on? So in other words, we're not having to double up on those costs just to get access to something. But while we want to do the solar project, hey, let's do the other repairs, and then we don't have to include scaffolding costs in that process as well. The other thing is to consider, this is not tenement, especially with tenements, it is not good to be cheap and cheerful. The inverters are going to be in your house, and that's probably the biggest point of failure, but you want to make sure that you're getting highest quality panels that you can buy, and you want to look at the warranty that's provided for them. You don't want to have a problem where you have to go back up on that roof. And generally we could say, higher quality equipment will have a lower failure rate. That's why they're willing to guarantee it for longer. So that's a big one to consider. You don't want, it's probably worth it to spend an extra 500 quid on your solar panel system and avoid a couple of grand later down the road if you have a problem because you bought something that isn't high spec. So that is a big consideration. Other key considerations, the most important one, bird netting. Do not install solar panels on a roof without bird netting, because the pigeons will find them and they will roost underneath, and then they will take and put guano all over your lovely new solar panels. That will drop, obviously, the voltage rating, reduce your production. It will look ugly. So it's just whatever the cost is, it's worth it. It's usually a nominal fee. It's not that much more, and the systems they have now are fairly easy to install, and they don't look too terrible. And in fact, from, let's say, a 2 or 3 story tenement, you're not even going to notice the difference between a system with the bird netting and without. But you will if there's no netting. The other consideration from a space standpoint is, as I mentioned before, you need to fuse these things. So you need spaces on your fuse board. So do consider that before going ahead, that you'll need room for an expansion board as likely. Or if you have room on the existing consumer board, that's fine, but just check your electric connection and see what spaces you have. If there's empty slots in your consumer board, then you'll be fine. If they're not and it's all full up, then consider that that's going to be an extra cost. You're going to have to wire that in. A third one, a lot of flats have hot water tanks. And so one of the things that we really recommend would be, if you have a hot water tank, don't get rid of it. What you can do is, there's an image here of what's called the eddy box, but these are basically diversion boxes. So they measure the current going back out to the grid, And when they reach a nominal amount, let's say 50 watts or something, they turn on the immersion coil within the hot water tank. So that means you're basically turning your hot water tank into a heat battery for hot water. And during summer months, and I mean anywhere from April to September, if your system's of a reasonable size, that could mean you get free hot water. So that really reduces, if you're on gas, that probably really reduces your gas costs. So that's a big one to consider. And they're not that expensive. And they're certainly a lot cheaper than a battery, a standard battery system. So it's worth it to look at that. So I think I've covered just about everything I wanted to. So I really appreciate your time today. If you're interested in doing a quick assessment, I would say check out our free My EcoCosi tool on our website, or drop us a line if you'd just be interested and happy to have a chat and talk about what you want to do to improve your property. And I'll hand things back over to Mike and our team for the Q&A session.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that was fantastic. Really informative, both from yourself and Stephen, actually, and hopefully that's generated some ideas and thinking about how, from the audience about what's possible to do. I think one thing that stuck out to me was the sort of the issue around the scaffolding and recognizing that, retrofit, repair, maintenance, they're not linear things. They're very much interconnected. So attending to the fabric of your building, making sure that it's wind tight and waterproof, and that you've got insulation that's appropriate for the kind of building that you're in, combined with using other retrofit measures, such as solar panels, is all interconnected, and doing them as sort of one effort is going to save you a lot of money. I mean, scaffolding is a huge expense when it comes to doing these kinds of works. So the more works that you can kind of get done with the existing scaffolding that you might have up there, the more money you're going to be able to save as far as sort of the projects that need to be done on your building. So we brought Dimo in here. So he also works is also another retrofit coordinator over at EcoCosi, and is going to be able to take some questions. Dimo, was there anything as far as from the presentation, from either of those presentations, or from your perspective, that you think is worth adding before we go over to some of the questions?
No, I think they were both very thorough and covered pretty much everything somebody needs to know. I see we have some interesting questions, which I'll be happy to get into, but I have nothing to add at this stage.
Great. Okay. Well, why don't we take a look at the questions that we have in, and we encourage you to pop them in to the Q&A chat room there, and we'll get through them. We're scheduled to finish at 1:00. We'll go over a little bit on that and see if we can get through other questions. But of course, please email us at info@underoneroof.scot. We'll put that back into the chat room if your question doesn't get answered or you want follow-up. If it's a question for Marc and Dimo, we'll just pass it on to them and they can answer you directly. We have a question from Mick, who says, what are the power distribution options for shared arrays to ensure fairness? And they give a couple examples. So solar for flats and Sol Share. Is that something you guys be able to address?
I can take that on, Mark, you can add in. So in the presentation, we took the view that every combination of panels will be on its own string. So basically what that is its own solar, each flat will have its own solar panel installation. And it's kind of almost, in that diagram, it's almost incidental that there are other arrays on the same roof that are connected to other flats. So that will be, I think, probably the fairest way of distributing it. SolShare is a really interesting way of distributing solar power on a shared roof. It does have some technical limitations. So, for example, they can only provide their services, the solution, if there's a three-phase supply that goes into the block of flats. So what that looks like is a really big thick cable that goes in, and then that splits into smaller cables. So one big supply into the whole tenement, and then smaller supplies that go in, individual supplies that go into each flat. So that's an option. I think the SolShare solution is most attractive for properties that are wholly owned by social landlords, who are under much stricter regulations to improve EPC ratings. For private homeowners, that might be less of a need to do that. And so our recommendation will probably be the diagram, the solution that Mark was describing, which is an individual string for each flat. But there may be other options that are explored. It would depend on the individual circumstances. Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Microphone on? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a few little things. I think the important part is to look at the budget. Generally, you're going to get the most value out of a solar panel system if you control it directly. So there is a certain element of also in terms of getting buy-in. If I'm spending the money and I'm not necessarily that keen, but like I've got neighbors who want to do this, then the value proposition might be back to them to say, look, you get, you're getting this is dedicated to you. And so the solar panel system is kind of discrete in the same way that the property itself is discrete. The other element of the budget that I think is really important is the battery storage capability. So either whether that's a hot water tank diversion system or a proper like full-on battery, I think it's important to look at that if that's within the budget. You'll get a lot more value than if you're sharing it. However, if you have a system that's just up there and it can be shared around and no one's concerned too much about the outcome, that might have its own value in terms of getting buy-in from flats where they just don't want to manage it and they don't want to have something installed or wired into their flat. So I guess it's bespoke. It's whatever works for you. I mean, as far as the three-phase thing is, I would say it's unlikely that a tenement building would not have a three-phase system coming in somewhere. But the way to check is to look at the where the main incomer is, and if it's three-phase, you kind of see these little plastic blocks come out. They're usually beveled at the edge, and if there's three, that's three-phase. If there's one, there'll be only one for each individual flat. I would imagine for four and a block, those kind of things, it's probably single phase. It'll be individual single phase for each flat. Whereas the bigger the building, the more likely it comes in as a three-phase incomer, because that's generally like what we would consider consumer, commercial grade connection, and then that gets split out. So.
Thanks, guys. Another question is, do you have any information on the possibilities for applying for grants for the installation of solar panels?
It depends on the type of building. Now, as I understand it, you might be able to get something because there's no more feed-in tariff and there's no more Home Energy Scotland support for solar that ended last year. So you're kind of on your own. But I'm just thinking there's I'm forgetting the grant writer because they're assumed community. What I would look up is community solar grants. So it might depend on the type of building you're in. If it's just for a tenement, I think you're unlikely to get grant support just for that. If you're part of maybe some sort of a co-op or there's some other social element to the building, then you might be able to find some grants out there. But I'd be looking for community solar support.
I can add maybe a little bit to that. Some mortgage providers offer cashback grants for owners installing energy efficiency improvements, such as solar panels in particular, or heat pumps. But that will be on an individual basis. For financial support for the whole array of panels, there's very limited options. Like Mark said, Home Energy Scotland, the Scottish Government, through the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan, pulled that offering a year and a bit ago. So at the moment, it's mostly self-financed.
Thanks, guys.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think the grant thing for communities is called CARES. So just look up solar community under CARES. I put it in the chat.
Great. Got another question from Martin. So can a flat get a battery system without solar panels? It seems that buying cheap wind in the early hours of the morning and using at peak times would be worth exploring and an environmental improvement. especially if you're not going to get 100% buy-in from the other tenement owners?
Yes, absolutely. Definitely do that. Look at your daily usage, as I mentioned, size the battery accordingly. The thing that you want to look for pricing it is look at the cost per kilowatt hour of storage. So that's come down a lot, but that would be the way you'd find the value play. And you probably, in this case, you probably don't necessarily go into a premium consideration. The one thing I would say is that, you know, it is now moving to recommended to have these things installed outside. So you may want to consider if you have an external installation option. But yeah, definitely worth doing, even without solar.
Yeah, but having said that, solar panels, it's the topic of today's webinar, and there's a reason for that. They're a really good improvement. They usually pay for themselves. When I had my solar panels installed, I was calculating less than 8 years of payback, and they generate electricity for 25, 30 years. They really are a wonderful long-term investment, and we would encourage people to explore it whenever possible. We do appreciate, and there's a reason why we're doing this webinar. There's a lot of hurdles to overcome, but they really are a really, really good improvement.
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping that what you can do with this resource as well is that you can send this webinar to, you know, people, and they can watch it and they can see, okay, this is what we're investing in, and what the value is. So
great, thanks, guys. And just we had one other. I just had a comment from David, who works for is basically part of a factoring startup, and is looking at the process of getting shared buildings retrofit ready. And David, yeah, absolutely, I encourage you to reach out to us at info@under1roof, and we can talk more, and bring Marc and Dimo into the conversation as well to see what we can be doing on the issue of factoring too. I mean, Stephen, is there anything from your end as far as sort of working with factors?
I think we did the factoring toolkit during the summer.
We did
earlier in the year, and we're
yeah.
trying to get a webinar going with them. But I think it'd be useful, even as Marc was talking, I don't want to send this webinar to factors. We need to get them in the room, because at the moment factors tend to be reactive rather than proactive, although David's saying they're looking to do something in the future. So I think it'd be useful to get them on board as soon as possible, either through the Factoring Toolkit webinar or a separate session with Marc and Dimo involved, because there are a lot of properties out there that are factored and they probably wouldn't know where to turn at the moment.
Yeah, and we did, so on that point, Stephen had mentioned, we've done research with Strathclyde University and developed a factoring toolkit so basically this is a 4 factors, and it, though it works, to be honest with you, it worked just fine for owners of flats as well. That goes through sort of the basics of what exists as far as different options for doing retrofit of flats. The idea is that we're hoping to both provide this toolkit as a sort of, when clients get in touch with their factors or their property managers to ask them questions about retrofit, that they'll have this as a guide that they can draw upon to answer basic questions around retrofit, and steer them in the direction of organizations like Changeworks, like EcoCosi projects, to let them know, what's available and what further information they can get, because factors ultimately are directed by their clients on what works that need to be done. Would encourage you to, it's on our website and in our resource section, but if you just search for factoring and retrofit, you'll find it easily enough, and it's a free downloadable resource like everything on our website, and you can look further into it. We'll take basically one more question from Louise. Sorry, Marc, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to say one of the, I think a really useful interface with factoring and solar is, if you look at what the big problem with factors is, getting paid. And getting like that kind of organization. So one thing that you could consider, both from the factor side and also from the tenant side, to get factors interested in this, is you could set up some of the panel systems to cover the base load of the building and offset the costs. If you're getting payback from that, from the grid, that could go also to offset the factor. So you can almost consider like the factor is almost like one of the tenants, and then that starts paying the bills. And when you think about that, like, you know, if you want to try to get buy-in from everybody, from all the stakeholders, that's a really good way to reduce the, you know, the impact of that. You know, you're getting free money put into the factoring bills, the factor's getting paid. You know, people are reducing their factoring costs, so it's it can be quite you know, a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question, and then we'll wrap it up from Louise. What are typical installment costs, and how long would it take to pay itself off?
It's a really good question, and Dimo and I can kind of, I think, both cover this separately. When I was installing, and I admit it's been a few years now since, we would be looking for a domestic house cost, and the way I would look at it is the price per watt to get a watt of generation up on your roof is about, let's say, 1.2, so 1 pound and 20 pence per watt. So that might be a little bit higher for a tenement building because your scaffolding costs will be higher. Also, your cabling, it depends on like how the ducting has been done in the building. An older building without like mod con ducting, it might get a bit expensive to run all the cabling. Usually that can be done on the outside, but again, if we're talking about working within a conservation zone, that those can be the cost. So I would start with that as kind of the median. Look at that at 1 pound 20 per watt. And then you can just apply that. Okay, so if we're having, you know, 2,700 kilowatts, then do the math, 2,700 times 1 pound 20 per watt. Assume that's going to be higher for a tenement, just because, like I said, all the access costs. And then I would price the battery in separately. I wouldn't include the battery in that cost because that has its own kind of value proposition. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Dimo. We could talk about.
Yeah, it would be quite individual. So it's really difficult to put a categorical, concrete figure on it. In terms of payback costs, it depends on whether there's a battery, the lifestyle of the people involved, the household, whether they're willing to change the electricity usage to maximize the electricity generation. So there's quite a lot of variables. I'd encourage anyone who's interested to go online. There's some free online tools, including on the Energy Saving Trust website, that can give people an indication. But until you speak to an installer and until somebody does a more thorough assessment, it's difficult to be more specific.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would expect your payback time frame to be about 7 years for a panel system. And the good thing is all the equipment costs are coming way down. So what's happening is costs for equipment are cheaper because there's a lot more coming on the market. There's a lot more competition. Labor costs are probably steady or a little bit higher. And certainly with cost of living, they're going up. I don't think access costs have changed that much other than in line with inflation. So probably I would use that again as the median, 7 years. If it's beyond that, then look at why. It's probably things like, okay, you've got a taller building, or the cabling is a little bit more difficult, and that's why that's been built in. It's something you can chat with your installer about. There's also lots of information if you just like publicly available information on the average cost of installing solar on the internet. So take a look there.
Great, thanks, guys, and thanks everybody for taking part and joining us today. Hopefully that was, I'm sure it was very informative and hopefully useful for you as an opportunity to go forward and explore whether this is a possibility in your flats, in your building. We're going to have another, we're going to be having another one of these sort of webinars probably a little bit later in the year. We wanted to have, Mark had very rightfully pointed out that having a webinar that focused on solar would be ideal in the sunnier months. So I think we're going to have another one though that talks a little bit about more of the retrofit options outside of solar later in the year. So keep an eye out for that. You can of course subscribe to Under One Roof's website newsletter on our website as well as all of our social media channels and the usual spots as well. We've got tons of information on that, and would encourage you, of course, to go over to the Changeworks, check out the EcoCosi service and information is provided there. And of course, you've got the handouts as well, and sort of the researches. So anyway, thanks everybody for taking part. Thanks, Marc and Dimo, Stephen, and we'll hopefully see you all again very soon. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone.